Trust is the perfect disguise, because when the wrong people wear it, they can walk right through your front door. The pounding on the front door shook the walls like an earthquake, rattling the very foundation of Daniel Cole's quiet new life. For a brief moment, he forgot who he was. Former deputy director of the FBI, a man who had spent decades unearthing criminal networks, leading high-stakes operations, and staring danger in the face without blinking. But old instincts never truly fade. His pulse quickened. His mind calculated a dozen scenarios in an instant. He'd been through countless raids, yet something about this particular intrusion felt off. He wasn't in Washington, D.C. anymore. He had moved to a picturesque neighborhood in Melbourne's outer suburbs, seeking solace before retirement. A place where the biggest concern should have been whose dog kept digging up the flower beds, not an apparent law enforcement raid at his doorstep. But these weren't federal agents. He could hear their voices, two men, sharp and impatient, barking orders at each other. They weren't pounding like neighbors checking in. They were hammering like they had a battering ram and an official warrant. Daniel moved swiftly through the half-unpacked boxes, his grip tightening as he reached for the doorknob. He wasn't just answering the door, he was stepping into a confrontation. And as he swung it open, he took in the sight of two uniformed men with rigid postures and hollow eyes. Their badges gleamed under the porch light, but something about them screamed fraud. Daniel Cole had faced hardened criminals, corrupt politicians, and sophisticated crime syndicates. He had interrogated warlords, uncovered sleeper cells, and led international sting operations. But standing before him now, these two so-called HOA enforcers didn't fit any of those molds. They were something far more amateur, and yet, somehow, far more reckless. The shorter one, a stocky man with a graying mustache, squared his shoulders. His fists remained clenched at his sides, as if prepared for confrontation. The taller one, wiry with a pair of thin-rimmed glasses, had shifty eyes that darted between Daniel's face and the dimly lit street behind him. They weren't here to chat. They were here to intimidate. "We've received multiple complaints," the tall one finally spoke, his voice rigid and rehearsed, like he was reciting lines from a poorly written script. "Your lawn is in violation of the HOA maintenance standards. This is an official warning." Daniel almost laughed. A warning? He had been in the house for barely a month, and his grass was maybe 2 inches tall. He'd seen real HOA disputes before. Those usually involved polite emails, passive-aggressive neighborhood Facebook posts, or at worst, a sternly worded letter. Never uniformed men pounding on doors like they were executing a drug bust. "Formal warning, huh?" Daniel said, folding his arms. "That sounds serious." The mustached man took a step forward. "It is," he said, voice sharp. "We're authorized to issue citations, fines, and if necessary, proceed with enforcement." There it was, that veiled threat. Daniel had spent a lifetime dissecting deception. The words, the posture, the overplayed intimidation tactic, it was textbook fraud. These two weren't here on HOA business. They were running a scam, and they had just picked the wrong target. "Enforcement?" Daniel asked, feigning confusion. "I wasn't aware the HOA had that kind of authority. Perhaps you could show me the specific clause that allows for that." The two men exchanged a fleeting glance, a crack in the act. "Sir, we're not here to debate," the tall one said, adjusting his glasses with a nervous twitch. "Failure to comply means immediate suspension of your community privileges, and possible arrest." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Arrest? An HOA with the power to detain people?" Now that was bold. "You're saying, if I don't pay a fine for my lawn, I could be arrested?" he said, keeping his voice calm, controlled. The mustached man nodded stiffly. "That's correct. And to avoid any hassle, we're willing to collect the fine in person. $1,000. Cash only." Ah, there it was. The real motive. Daniel exhaled slowly, letting the silence settle between them. He could feel the tension shifting, their impatience growing. The mustached man's fingers twitched near his belt, as if resisting the urge to make a move. The tall one, despite his thin bravado, had a sheen of sweat forming at his temple. These weren't just con men. They were desperate con men. And desperate men were dangerous. Still, Daniel was in no rush. He tilted his head slightly, playing the part of a hesitant, slightly intimidated homeowner. "Well, gentlemen," he said with a forced sigh, "I'd love to settle this properly. Maybe I can grab my checkbook." "No checks," the mustached man snapped, almost too quickly. No electronic transfers. HOA policy. Another crack in the story. HOA policy, huh? Daniel resisted the urge to smirk. Instead, he nodded. Right, makes sense. Give me 1 second. I'll grab my cash. He took a slow step back inside, his movements measured. The moment the door clicked shut, he moved. Down the hallway, past the half-assembled furniture, into his small home office. His battered leather FBI credential case was in a locked drawer, right where it always was. He wasn't just about to expose them. He was about to shut them down. Now, here's where I want to hear from you, the audience. What do you think is really going on here? Are these just con men, or is there something bigger at play? Comment 1 if you think this is just a scam gone wrong. Comment 2 if you suspect a deeper conspiracy. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, this is about to get even crazier. Daniel Cole moved with the precision of a man who had spent decades walking the thin line between order and chaos. The moment the door shut, he was in motion, down the hallway, past the unpacked boxes, his mind racing ahead of his steps. These two weren't just running a basic con. Their behavior was too brazen, too bold for simple scammers. No, this was something else. Reaching his office, Daniel twisted the key to his filing cabinet, flipping through classified documents, old case files, and finally, his worn leather badge holder. His fingers traced over the embossed FBI insignia for the briefest second before he palmed it, slipping it into his pocket. The weight of it was both familiar and grounding. He took a slow breath. How far were these men willing to take this? Returning to the foyer, Daniel cracked the door open slightly. The two men were still there, shifting uncomfortably under the dim porch light. The mustached one had his arms crossed, jaw clenched. The tall one kept glancing up and down the street as if expecting something. Daniel made his voice just hesitant enough to sell it. I couldn't find my checkbook. Maybe we can work something out? The mustached man stepped forward. Too eager, too impatient. Cash only, he barked. No digital payments, no checks. Daniel let his gaze flick over them. The uniforms up close were wrong. The gold emblem was too large, the stitching too crisp. Mass-produced, not official issue. But more than that, these men carried themselves like criminals trying to act too much like cops. Then he saw it. The small twitch in the mustached man's right hand, hovering near his belt. Was it a weapon? A prop? Either way, this was about to escalate. Daniel inhaled, stepping further out onto the porch, the night air cool against his skin. Funny thing, he said conversationally. I've lived in a lot of neighborhoods. Never once have I seen an HOA with an actual enforcement division. The tall one stiffened. The mustached man's eyes narrowed. We're fully authorized, the tall one said quickly, his voice a little too rehearsed. Oh? Then you wouldn't mind showing me your IDs, would you? Silence. A beat too long. Then the mustached man cleared his throat. Our identification is privileged information. Daniel arched an eyebrow. Right. And I suppose you have official documents to back that up? The mustached man didn't flinch. Not for your eyes. That was it. That was the moment Daniel knew. These men weren't just bluffing, they were playing for something bigger. His right hand twitched toward his pocket, where his FBI badge rested. The urge to shut this down now was overwhelming. But no. He needed to see how far they'd push this, needed to understand the real angle. Then the mustached man moved. A single step forward, aggressive, hand reaching for something. Daniel's instincts kicked in. In one fluid motion, he pulled his badge from his pocket and flashed it. Federal Bureau of Investigation, he said, his voice low, steady. You want to arrest me? Try harder. The effect was instantaneous. The tall one's face went sheet white. The mustached man froze, his mouth slightly open, as if his brain was struggling to process what had just happened. Daniel saw it then. The fight or flight moment. They weren't trained for this. They had expected to intimidate a civilian, not run into a former FBI deputy director. The mustached man's hand twitched again, but this time it wasn't toward a weapon. It was toward his feet. He was going to run. Daniel squared his stance. I'd suggest you don't do that. The tall one's gaze darted toward the street. He was calculating. Could he make a break for it? Could they talk their way out? Then, a single bead of sweat rolled down the mustached man's temple. Daniel saw it before it even happened. The moment the decision was made, The mustached man turned, lunged. Daniel moved first. Daniel's body reacted before his mind even finished processing. The mustached man lunged, shoving past him with surprising strength. Daniel barely shifted his weight in time to absorb the impact, his FBI training kicking in like second nature. He spun with the momentum, his foot planting firmly on the ground, steadying himself as the conman stumbled forward. The tall one was already moving, bolting down the porch steps, legs pumping like a deer in flight. For a split second, Daniel considered tackling them right then and there, but his instincts screamed against it. Two men, possibly armed, unknown backup, unknown motive. The smarter move? Let them run, but don't let them escape. He took off after them, his breath steady, controlled. The mustached man's heavy footfalls pounded against the pavement ahead, while the taller man, though faster, was uncoordinated, panicked. They were heading straight toward the cul-de-sac, where a battered sedan idled at the curb, engine running. Backup. Daniel's mind locked onto the detail instantly. Someone was waiting for them. Someone who was part of this. The moment the tall one yanked open the sedan's passenger door, Daniel knew his window was closing. If they got inside that car, they were gone. He pushed harder. The mustached man reached the back door, fumbling with the handle as the driver, a woman, short hair, shadowed face, revved the engine anxiously. Daniel made a snap decision. Instead of going for the men, he went for the car. With a final burst of speed, he angled his body and slammed his palm against the driver's side window. The woman startled, eyes going wide. For a split second, her foot hesitated on the gas. That was all Daniel needed. He shifted, lunging toward the mustached man just as the conman wrenched open the back door. His hand snatched the back of the man's shirt, twisting fabric into a tight grip. The man yelped, trying to jerk free, but Daniel was already pivoting. Using the momentum, he yanked the mustached man off balance, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. The tall one was already halfway inside the car, eyes wild, shouting something to the driver. Then tires screeched. The car lurched forward. Daniel barely had time to register the movement before he felt the fabric rip from his grasp. The mustached man, half dragged, half thrown, scrambled into the open door as the sedan peeled away. Daniel snapped his head up, locking onto the license plate. J4C-mud. The rest of the plate was smeared, obscured. Damn it. The car fishtailed slightly as it sped down the street, nearly clipping a mailbox before vanishing around the bend. Daniel exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. He clenched his fists. Not over, not even close. A movement from across the street caught his eye. Curtis, his elderly neighbor, was standing frozen on his porch, phone in hand. "The hell was that?" Curtis called out, his voice a mix of awe and concern. Daniel straightened, adjusting his jacket. "A problem." Curtis glanced down the street where the car had disappeared. "You want me to call the cops?" Daniel's gaze lingered on the empty road, his mind already working through the next steps. "Already on it," he muttered, pulling out his phone. The game had just begun. Daniel's grip on the mustached man's shirt tore free just as the sedan's tires screeched against the asphalt. The vehicle shot forward, the tall man barely managing to yank his legs inside before the door slammed shut. The mustached man scrambled, one foot still on the pavement, his body lurching as the car dragged him forward. For a split second, Daniel considered diving forward, yanking him back before he could fully climb in. But just as he lunged, the driver, a woman, dark hair pulled back tight, her face shadowed by the dim streetlights, punched the accelerator. The mustached man flopped into the back seat, his shoe ripping off in the process. The sedan fishtailed, its rear bumper barely missing a parked SUV as it careened around the cul-de-sac's curve. The escape and the hunt. Daniel's grip on the mustached man's shirt tore free just as the sedan's tires screeched against the asphalt. The vehicle shot forward, the tall man barely managing to yank his legs inside before the door slammed shut. The mustached man scrambled, one foot still on the pavement, his body lurching as the car dragged him forward. For a split second, Daniel considered diving forward, yanking him back before he could fully climb in. But just as he lunged, the driver, a woman, dark hair pulled back tight, her face shadowed by the dim streetlights, punched the accelerator. The mustached man flopped into the back seat, his shoe ripping off in the process. The sedan fishtailed, its rear bumper barely missing a parked SUV as it careened around the cul-de-sac's curve. Damn it! The car's taillights shrank in the distance, swallowed by the darkness of the suburban streets. But they had made mistakes. Big ones. Daniel turned sharply. Curtis, his neighbor, was still standing frozen on his porch, his phone gripped tightly in one hand. "The hell just happened?" Curtis asked, his voice shaking slightly. Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders, forcing himself back into calculated control. "You get a picture?" Curtis blinked, looking down at his phone. I think so." "Send it to me." Without waiting for a response, Daniel pulled out his own phone, dialing with precise, steady movements. The line clicked. "This is Cole," he said, his voice cool, composed. "I need a BOLO issued immediately. Late model sedan, battered frame, possibly dark gray. 2 male suspects, 1 female driver. Partial plate J4C. Ran a scam impersonating law enforcement and fled. Could be armed, proceed with caution." There was a beat of silence on the other end before the dispatcher responded. "Copy that. Forwarding to all units." Daniel hung up and took another deep breath, his mind already running 10 steps ahead. They had been too bold, too aggressive, not ordinary conmen. That meant one of two things. They were either desperate, or they were testing something bigger. Curtis walked over, still holding his phone. "I sent you the photo," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Man, I've lived here 20 years. Never seen anything like that." Daniel glanced at the message on his phone. The photo was blurry, taken in the chaos, but clear enough to show the driver's profile in the dim glow of the dashboard. He narrowed his eyes. Something about her face tugged at a memory. A case from years ago? A known associate? He wasn't sure yet, but he'd find out. "This isn't over," Daniel muttered, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Not even close?" Daniel stood motionless for a long moment, his breathing steady, but his mind anything but. The cold night air wrapped around him, but he hardly noticed. His focus was locked onto the dim glow of his phone screen, where the blurred image of the getaway driver stared back at him. There was something familiar about her, something buried deep in the recesses of his memory. Curtis shifted beside him, still rattled. "You gonna tell me what the hell that was all about?" Daniel exhaled slowly. Not sure yet. It wasn't a lie. He had theories, instincts screaming at him, but nothing concrete. Not yet. A pair of red and blue flashes cut through the darkness, and within seconds, a black and white cruiser rolled up to the curb. The tires crunched against the pavement as 2 uniformed officers stepped out, hands already resting near their holsters. "Mr. Cole?" one of them asked, a younger cop with a sharp gaze. "That's me." "We got the report. Impersonating officers, attempted fraud. What can you tell us?" Daniel didn't waste time. He relayed the key details: 2 men, fake uniforms, aggressive tactics, a cash demand, and a frantic getaway. The officers took notes, their expressions tightening with every word. The second officer, older, with a weary expression that told Daniel he'd seen too much in his career, let out a slow whistle. "Bold move. Usually these scams are done through the mail, maybe a phone call. Showing up in person? That's risky. Either they're stupid or desperate." "Maybe both," Daniel muttered. He rubbed his jaw, his thoughts racing. "They were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I cracked." The young cop frowned. "Testing for what?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and swiped back to the photo Curtis had taken. He turned the screen toward them. "Recognize her?" The older officer stiffened. Daniel caught the reaction instantly. "You know her," he said, voice flat. The officer hesitated before nodding. "Maybe. If it's who I think it is, she's bad news." Daniel's jaw clenched. He had expected low-level grifters, 2 idiots running a cheap con in the wrong neighborhood. But if there was already a record on the woman driving that sedan, then this was something bigger. "What's her name?" Daniel asked. The officer hesitated again, but then sighed. "Madeline Hayes, known associate of some mid-level fraud rings operating out of Nevada and Arizona. She disappeared off our radar a year ago." Daniel's mind locked in. The scams, the uniforms, the personal approach. They weren't just robbing people, they were scouting. And now, they had tested the wrong man. Daniel absorbed the name, Madeline Hayes. It rattled through his mind like a bullet casing hitting concrete. The fact that she had resurfaced here, in his supposedly quiet neighborhood, was no coincidence. The older officer, Detective Alvarez, his badge now visible, sighed and crossed his arms. We thought she'd gone underground, had a few close calls running high-end fraud in Vegas, then vanished. But if she's back and she's running cons this brazen, he shook his head. She's planning something. Daniel's thoughts ran ahead, piecing together the puzzle faster than Alvarez could lay out the edges. She's not just running scams, Daniel said. She's testing response times, seeing who in this neighborhood will roll over, who will fight back. Maybe even mapping out potential marks, people who live alone, who trust uniforms, who have money. The young officer, still taking notes, frowned. You think this is bigger than a quick cash grab? Daniel's gaze flicked down the street where the sedan had disappeared. I think it's organized. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated by the distant hum of suburban life, the occasional porch light flickering, a dog barking 2 streets over, the sound of a late-night jogger's footfalls on pavement. Curtis, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. So, what do we do now? Daniel had already made up his mind. I send my footage to the bureau, he said. Run every frame of that car, that plate, their faces. Someone will recognize them. Someone already has. He shot a glance at Alvarez. You have a file on her? The detective exhaled sharply. Not a deep one, but enough. I can pull it up first thing in the morning. Do it. The young officer looked between them. Should we issue a local alert? Daniel shook his head. Number, not yet. If she knows she's burned, she'll vanish again. We wait. Let her think she got away clean. Curtis let out a low whistle. Man, I just wanted a quiet night. Now I feel like I'm in a damn spy movie. Daniel smirked, but his mind was elsewhere. Madeline Hayes wasn't finished, and neither was he. Daniel sat at his desk, the soft hum of his laptop filling the quiet space. The house was still littered with unpacked boxes, remnants of a life he had planned to settle into, a life that now felt like a distant illusion. His fingers moved swiftly, transferring the footage from his phone, enhancing the images, running them through encrypted software connected to his old bureau contacts. The names Madeline Hayes, 2 male associates, and a battered gray sedan were now flagged in multiple law enforcement databases. If they made a move anywhere in the state, someone would know. But Daniel wasn't betting on them making mistakes. No, if Madeline had been smart enough to stay off the grid for a year, she wouldn't slip up now. She was already adjusting, already planning her next move. His eyes scanned the blurry photo Curtis had captured, the faint outline of Madeline's profile, the tension in her grip on the steering wheel. She hadn't just been a getaway driver. She had been leading the operation. A leader always had a plan. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Daniel reached instinctively toward his drawer, where his firearm lay, locked and ready. He had spent too many years learning the hard way that trouble often knocked twice. But as he approached the door, he heard a familiar voice. Cole, it's me. Daniel relaxed, slightly. He unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open to find Detective Alvarez standing on the porch, his face hard set, an envelope in his hand. The officer's cruiser was still idling at the curb. We found something, Alvarez said. Daniel stepped aside, motioning him in. Alvarez didn't waste time. He placed the envelope on the table, flipping it open to reveal a grainy surveillance image. It had been printed from traffic cam footage, a snapshot of the sedan fleeing the neighborhood, captured from a nearby intersection. Daniel leaned in, the plate. It was cleaner in this shot. The mud that had obscured it before had been shaken loose. J4C-589, Alvarez read aloud. Registered to an abandoned warehouse lot in Phoenix. Fake registration. Car was reported stolen 6 months ago. Daniel narrowed his eyes. They had covered their tracks. This isn't small time, Alvarez muttered. Most con artists don't bother with stolen vehicles and fake precincts. They hit a target and move on. But these people? They're setting something up. Daniel already knew. He could feel it. And if they thought they had chosen the perfect town for their scheme, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The events of this story are a stark reminder that crime is evolving. In 2025, with the rise of AI-driven scams, deepfake technology, and increasingly sophisticated fraud rings, deception is no longer limited to phishing emails or phone calls. Criminals are becoming bolder, more strategic, and more willing to take risks in person. The fake HOA enforcers weren't just looking for a quick payday. They were testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, and identifying potential victims. becoming bolder, more strategic, and more willing to take risks in person. The fake HOA enforcers weren't just looking for a quick payday. They were testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, and identifying potential victims. For former FBI Deputy Director Daniel Cole, this wasn't just another fraud case. It was a warning. These criminals had infiltrated a quiet suburban neighborhood, believing they could manipulate trust, disguise themselves as authority figures, and pressure homeowners into compliance. But what if Daniel hadn't been there? How many other communities might already be compromised? This isn't just about one small scam. It's about a growing threat. Fraudsters are adapting, and the only way to fight back is to stay informed, stay vigilant, and never accept authority at face value without proof. Daniel knew it, and now, so do we. Daniel exposed them, but they got away. The question now is, where will they strike next? Should Daniel dig deeper, trace Madeline Hayes' movements, and uncover the larger operation behind this fraud ring? Or should he play it smart, letting them think they've escaped while gathering evidence from the shadows? What would you do in his position? Drop a comment below. Should he chase them down immediately or wait for the perfect moment to strike? And if you want to see justice served, show your support for Daniel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. The fight isn't over. It's just beginning.